Legend Total War here, and today we're doing another tier list using Tier Maker, this time covering the unit roster of Cathay. So Cathay has a really interesting unit roster in that most of their units are quite viable thanks to the yin-yang system. So a unit with normally pretty trashy stats is made pretty useful by the fact that they're particularly cheap and then boosted by having a complemented unit. So the Harmony system really helps make their entire roster, bar a couple of units, quite viable. So when putting units into this tier list, keep in mind that there really isn't that much of a difference between S tier and C tier. However, the ones in D tier are the only ones I would designate as do not recruit these units. You're going to get poor results out of them. I mean, unless you really enjoy them. Okay, first up, let's talk about the Peasant Archers. So Peasant Archers, they're going to go under A tier. This is the bread and butter of your early game unit. This is the one that you'll be recruiting, you should be recruiting the most. This is your damage dealer in the early game. Cheap, very easy to replace. You can globally recruit them quite well. Because if you've got just 10 settlements, you can globally recruit them in one turn. Because they don't require a military building to be constructed. Obviously their stats are pretty low. They have low leadership, whatever. But like I said, for a tier 0 unit, this unit here does the job and really is quite useful in the early stages of the campaign. Then we've got the peasant long spears here, also going into A tier. So normally with melee infantry, you often find me putting them in C and D tier, but not so much in Warhammer 3. The melee cheats on very hard battle difficulty aren't that bad. They are still noticeable, but they're not that bad. And the peasant long spearmen, while I definitely wouldn't put an army with half of them, I usually try to put maybe a third of my army in the early game to have peasant long spears, because these guys here, if they're close enough to a archer unit, they get a pretty decent melee defense buff, and it varies depending on harmony modifiers, and they're very easy to replace. So I kind of expect them in the battle to take pretty much all of the damage and then just re-recruiting them in global recruitment pretty much instantly. So they do a good job at what they're meant to do, which is to hold the line for archers. Next up is the Jade Warriors. So this one here, going into the game just briefly. So these ones here being tier 0 units, really effective. Once you start moving into tier 2 and 3, you might want to start building military buildings if you want, if you've got multiple provinces. So the Jade Warriors are actually a tier 1 unit, and for a tier 1 units, their stats are pretty damn amazing, and their upkeep cost isn't that bad either. 125 upkeep compared to 87 upkeep base is not that big of a difference in upkeep cost, but the quality is significantly there. So this one here doesn't have anti-large, which is probably more preferable if you're going to protect archers, but just having a lot of extra armor, a lot of extra leadership, this is not a bad unit at all. So I'm going to be putting just the regular Jade Warriors at A tier as well, because they're good, they do a good job. Then for the Jade Warrior Halberds, these ones here are a tier 3 unit, and they definitely perform at a tier 3 level. Their upkeep cost is good compared to, like, for what they are. They're a good replacement for early game trashy spearmen. So if you want to be a little bit better with your armies, take on a little bit more with each army, then the Jade Warrior Halberd is an A tier unit. Definitely not entering S tier, but these ones here, they do the job fairly well. They've gotten good results out of them. Then we've got the Jade Warrior Crossbowmen. So there's two variants. There's the regular and the shielded variant. The regular is tier 2. The crossbow, the shielded one is tier 3. And guess what? These two units are both A tier. So they're armored units. They don't have a lot of armor piercing in their crossbows. They have a bit higher leadership than the regular peasant archers. They've got longer range. They're relative to their stats and to their cost, they're at the same degree of value for the cost that they provide. The only real difference between a Jade Warrior army compared to a peasant army is if you do take a lot of damage with Jade Warriors and you're not in a home territory, globally recruiting them will probably take more than one turn, so they're just not as replaceable. But that being said, if you've got a Jade Warrior army, you will take fewer casualties than if you've got a peasant army, so it's more reliable at a higher cost, but less replaceable. Next up is the which one are these called? They're not the Crane Gunners. They're called Iron Hail Gunners. So a tier 2 unit. low range, high missile strength. This is your early game armor piercing. So this one here, I think everyone's sort of expecting me to just put everything in under A tier, but no. This one here is not quite as effective. In the early stages of the campaign, you don't really need that much armor piercing, usually. Their low range isn't quite as valuable as having a 140 range with the peasant archers. They can do a lot of damage, but because they have to get in closer to the enemy, they'll oftentimes get shot before anybody else. So while their damage output is really good, they also tend to take a lot of damage. And I just find that going with longer range is better. But if you're going up against later stages of the campaign and you need lower tier units and you need armor piercing, this is definitely a very useful unit. Don't consider B tier to be crap. They're just not really as cost effective as these A tier ones here. Now, as for the crane gunners here, that's what they're called, right? Let me just double check that. Yeah, crane gunners. Interesting thing with them, they're very similar to rattling Jezzails, right? And people sort of expect me to put this one in S tier. Oh, is this a doom stack because, you know, Jezzails are so good? Well, this one here I found actually wasn't really that good at all. I'm going to put it under B tier and almost at C tier. So I'll explain why. I did actually try out an army of crane gunners and I found them to be pretty underwhelming. If they use up all of their ammunition on a target, I usually find that they end up doing about 8,000 to 12,000 damage in a single battle. That's if they use up all of their ammo. And considering the long range, the low entity numbers, and sort of the low missile strength here, it's really difficult to get a lot of value out of this unit. What you're paying for with the upkeep cost there is extreme range. Very useful if, you know, the balance of power is in your favor in the first place, but if it's not in your favor, it's going to be very difficult for this unit shooting into a hail of low tier units to get its value. Once it's used up all of its ammunition, it's completely useless in melee. It has some line of sight issues because they need a very clear line of sight because they're guns. They're just a finicky unit with kind of low damage output. Even when you give them extra ammunition, it's just kind of hard to get your worth out of them. So they're at B tier because they are decent. They're only tier 3. They are decent, but it's difficult to get as much value out of them using them effectively as it is to get these other units here, which was a little bit disappointing to see that because that was a unit that could have potentially been quite good, but they just kind of have a low damage output. Next up, we have Celestial Guard. So, these units here are excellent. This is tier 4 and tier 5. These are really, really good troops. And considering the price of them, the upkeep cost, which is the main thing I look for in campaign, because generally speaking, the recruit cost isn't that big of a deal, because you should be recruiting the unit and then keeping it for a really long time. You shouldn't be constantly replacing elite troops. If you are, then something's going horribly wrong. So, 275 for one of the best anti-large melee infantry units in the game is very respectable. So, this unit here is going under S tier. Really good melee infantry that you can very heavily rely on. Will hold the line for ages. They'll pretty much fight to the death. Excellent troop. Then you've got the Celestial Dragon Crossbowmen. Also, a really excellent troop. So, I'm also going to put them at S tier. Again, just looking at these Celestial Dragon Crossbowmen, this is a unit that has 160 range, is like late game armor piercing, right? It shoots 2 bolts, each of which is doing about 17 damage. The reload time's a bit slow, but as it gains experience, it will fire a lot faster. They have tons of armor, they've got shields, and they can hold their own in melee quite well. So even once you've used up all of their ammunition, they can still do a good job in melee. Assuming you're not completely overwhelmed by enemies. This is a very strong unit. It has the same upkeep cost as the Celestial Dragon Guard. At 275, this definitely pushes its balance of power and value if you're recruiting them. So late game unit, these are excellent troops, especially in Miao Ying's army. So that's the infantry. The Cathayan infantry is excellent across the board. Now let's move on to the cavalry. the peasant horseman. The thing about this one is that it's cheap, it's a piece of crap, but it's also kind of useless. I'm going to put this one under D tier because the only real use of peasant horseman is to distract the enemy, which is fine, but there's other units you can use, and to run units down once they've already broken. And the thing is, in Total War Warhammer, running down broken units is not that essential, because just kind of the way the game works, if you've won the battle, then having a unit that basically didn't participate in the victory run down a handful of troops is not as useful as having a unit that actually contributes actively to the victory, like missile units do. So if we have just a quick look at the peasant horseman, right? It's a tier 1 unit, requires a military building. Their only upkeep cost is 100. It's not too bad. That's a little bit more expensive than the other peasant units, but their stats are just horrible. They're just not going to kill anything. They rear charge a unit, they're just going to get wrecked. Their only use is to use as a distraction and to run down broken units, and there's better units you can use for that anyway. Okay, so next one is the Jade Lancers. So this one here, again, is not an amazing unit. I'm going to put it under C tier. It's definitely more cost effective than the Peasant Horsemen. If we briefly have a look at them, they're a tier 3 unit. They're kind of comparable to Empire Knights, but I do think they're slightly better. They got a base speed of 66, which isn't very good, which is one of the reasons why it's going into C tier. They got a lot of armor, and they got shields, which is very good. Decent amount of charge bonus. But what we're missing here is specializing. We're not seeing cavalry that are either anti-large or anti-infantry. These are units that require a lot of micro, suffer from knockdown problems, as in they will knock down a unit and not damage it. The charges from cavalry just doesn't really seem to do a lot of damage across the board. Even if you're charging into a relatively weak unit, that unit will just end up standing back up and doing a lot of damage. These units get stuck. Horse cavalry in general in Warhammer 3 are just not really effective units. But if you do want somebody to run down broken units, at least this unit here can potentially contribute to the victory, but you have to be very careful in using it. Do not charge them into the front of any kind of melee infantry. It really should just be focusing on taking out missile units and running down broken melee infantry. So that's why it's going into C tier there. Now, the Jade Longma, however, these are really good. They're an A tier unit, because these are essentially Pegasus Knights. Now, their models look like flying horses, right? But being able to fly is a big advantage. They got 105 speed base. If we just go and have a quick look at their stats. While these also don't have a speciality like the Pegasus Knights from Bretonnia, because they are anti-large, these are still very strong. They got good stats across the board, high amount of armor, high amount of leadership, good charge bonus, and their ability to fly makes them quite useful to get in and out of combat quite handily. They're good at taking out flying enemies such as Chaos Furies, which you'll probably go up against quite a few. But these are quite reliable. The only problem with it is that it's a tier 5 unit, so for a tier 5 troop, it's maybe a little bit on the expensive side, so maybe it actually belongs under B tier in terms of cost effective, but it is a very strong unit. It teeters on the edge of being A tier, but I think I'll leave it at B tier. Just for what it is, you're kind of better off actually just going with Celestial Dragon Guard, and maybe just getting 1 or 2 of them if you really want some cavalry. They're not good at running down units that have routed. They're there to participate in the victory, not finish off units after the fact. Okay, now with the artillery, we'll talk about the Grand Cannons first. So just having a look at them. The Grand Cannon has a range of 450, which is one of the highest range artillery pieces in the new units in Total War Warhammer 3. Flaming artillery piece with quite a lot of ammo, a lot of missile damage. These are quite accurate as well. And for its upkeep cost, this is really where you should be focusing your armor piercing, not the Iron Hail Gunners. At 1 tier, actually, it does not take long to go from tier 2 to tier 3. If you need armor piercing in your army, this one here is way more cost effective than Iron Hail Gunners, because that range is really good, and a single shot from the Grand Cannon can absolutely obliterate a single entity or an infantry unit. This is a good unit in all situation types and very useful against walled sieges. So that was one of the main reasons why I put these two here at B tier, because this one here is just way better than it, and this one is going into S tier. Then we've got the Fire Rain rockets. Now, they're very similar to Hellstorm rocket batteries, with one significant exception. They don't have anywhere near as much range. The Empire equivalent, the Hellstorm rocket batteries, have huge amounts of range. It's like nearly 500 range on those units, which allows them to shoot basically halfway across the map. Now, these ones here arguably dish out more damage, and maybe even fire faster, but having that extra range definitely does help. Now, I'm going to put these also at S tier because they are really good at dishing out damage. If you need damage dealers in your army and you need siege attackers, these are the two units you should go for. But yeah, you've got the tier 3 option or the tier 4 option, both of which are really good. Doesn't take too long to get to tier 4 as Cathay, so you can rely on this unit fairly early on. Next up, we have the Sky Lanterns. This unit sucks. This is the worst unit in their roster. This is the most undertuned unit in the game, essentially. Looking at its stats, it just sucks, right? So it's an always flying unit, so you can't use it in melee. It has ridiculously low damage output. It's really high range, lots of ammunition, but the missile damage 120, it might seem like this one here can inflict a lot of damage, but even if it uses up all of its ammo, it's very difficult for this one to do anything more than its own value. For a 250 upkeep cost unit at tier 3, this is absolute trash. For the same price, the Grand Cannon, even though it's not quite as vulnerable as an always flying unit, has way more potential for killing. Just a couple of volleys of the Grand Cannon can easily outperform the entire salvo of a Sky Lantern. And the thing is, once the Sky Lantern has run out of ammunition, it's completely useless. If there are any flying units like Chaos Furies or whatever, they will take down a Sky Lantern super quickly. And since it can't land and it's super slow, it just can't get out of combat. This is such a piece of shit. Do not recruit this. Don't even use it as a mount. So the magistrates can use the Sky Lantern as a mount. Avoid this unit at all costs. Like if you're going to recruit Peasant Horseman, the other D tier unit, that's like fair enough. But this one here has practically no value whatsoever. Do not recruit. Absolute piece of crap. In fact, we should almost have an E tier for it. It's so crap. Absolute piece of shit. And then we've got the Sky Junk. This one here is the exact opposite of the Sky Lantern. Sky Junks are awesome because these ones here can actually do their worth. I'm going to put it under A tier, not under S tier, and I'll explain why. So, Sky Junk is essentially a single entity Hellstorm rocket, well, what was it called? Fire Rain rocket unit. But here's the thing to consider, that the Fire Rain rockets have four entities, so it essentially shoots 4 times faster. This one here does have 15 ammunition instead of 12, but this one still here on ultra unit scale essentially has way more ammunition because it's 12 times 4 essentially. One great thing about this though is it actually has a secondary ammunition which is unlimited, which is the Sky Lantern type ammo. Just the regular 275 range, like bullets somebody's shooting with a crane gunner on the thing. So once it's run out of ammunition, it can be really useful in that regard to just consistently get more and more damage. But the thing is, it's very slow to do that. Apparently twirling them around in a circle will also allow them to fire a lot faster with those bullets. So really good troop, but I just don't think it belongs at S tier because you recruit it at tier 5. It's a little bit more expensive than the Fire Rain rocket. I think for a tier 5 unit, it doesn't really belong there. It belongs at tier 4. If it was tier 4, I'd probably put it under S tier, but I think it belongs under A tier. Still a really good unit, don't get me wrong. Being in A tier is not bad at all, but I think it's a little bit less cost effective than the Fire Rain rockets. Okay, next up is the Wujing War Compass. Now, I'm not a huge fan of this unit at all. It definitely doesn't belong in D tier, but I'm going to put it under C tier. The reason for this, and I'll explain why, is a lot of the bonuses that it has are not really that valuable. but are better used as a mount for astromancers in the army. Now, there was a little bit of talk earlier in the game life cycle, in early access, about a Wujing War Compass Doomstack, and I just didn't see that being particularly viable, because the Nexus of Elemental Winds, power recharge rate plus 20%, that's good, but you have to keep in mind that unless you've got a Jade amulet, you will not be able to access unlimited winds of magic, and you'll have a maximum of 120 to spend. Their spells here are unupgraded versions of heaven magic, so you're actually better off with an astromancer on a Wujing War Compass, which don't get me wrong, if you do that, that's pretty good, but recruiting the regular unit I think is actually quite bad, because this unit here is terrible in melee as well. It's just really, really bad. Does have a lot of missile resistance, a lot of armor and everything, but if it gets surrounded and is fighting monsters, it's not a good thing at all. For its upkeep cost, it's just, there's a lot of armies out there that'll totally wreck you. Mastery of the Elemental Winds. This is another thing that sort of is one of the more overhyped mechanics of the games. So every unit that you have that has Mastery of the Elemental Winds will make all of the spellcasters in your army 15% more effective up until the 200% mark. Now, there is a huge misconception going on about Mastery of the Elemental Winds. Huge misconception. It says bonus 200%. Some people think that means plus 200%. No, this doubles the effectiveness of the spells, not triples it, okay? If it was plus 200% and triples it, it would say though, but it says 100%. And notice that if you don't have, well, let's just say you put the first one in the army, it says 115%, right? That first one isn't worth a plus 115%, it's worth plus 15%. Huge misconception, people overhyped this unit. It is probably one of the most overrated units in the game. It is a Doomstack you can use against really easy enemies, but against late game armies, no. Having one or two of them in the army though is fine. It's definitely not a D tier unit, but what I would recommend with the Wujing War Compass is have access to astromancers, put one or two in the army if you want to make use of the Master of the Elemental Winds and Nexus of Winds, and use his magic instead, because he'll be better fighter. You'll be able to put equipment on him. The regular Wujing War Compass being a tier 4 unit, just absolutely a no-go for me. Not D tier, but I wouldn't put it any higher than C tier, because terrible in melee, it's just, it doesn't really have that much utility, in my opinion. And then the next, the final one is the Terracotta Sentinels. So this unit here, I'm going to put that under, it's tempting to put it under S tier, but here's the thing. I actually think it's A tier, because they are very expensive and you don't really need it, and Total War Warhammer 3 doesn't really incentivize you to build Doomstacks. They're unbreakable, that's great. They don't really have a lot of missile resistance, they've just got the armor, so they are quite vulnerable to that. They're reasonably good speed, but I just don't think they belong under S tier. Spamming them can make a very strong Doomstack, but it's also very expensive and unnecessary. There's not a lot of things out there that can boost it. They're very good in Zhao Ming's army because he's able to give plus 10 melee attack, but in general, in other armies, I'd probably not really worry about getting this unit unless you're like absolutely rolling in cash. It's hardly essential, and with these tier lists here, this really shouldn't be an indication of the strongest units, but the units that you can rely on the most, that aren't going to break your economy, that you're going to get the most value on. And when we look at the Terracotta Sentinel, for 400 upkeep cost, that's significantly more than a Celestial Dragon Guard, and this is a unit that can probably outkill it. You know, it does do a lot of weapon strength, but it's cumbersome, so it doesn't quite attack as fast. It does do magic attacks, so it's useful against the big demons. So having maybe one or two of them, yeah, that can work in your army, but just be wary about spamming them. I don't really recommend it unless you're really rolling around in cash. So I think A tier is a good place for them. And that's my tier list for Cathay. They've got a very good roster with most of their units in like the S, A, and B tier being quite viable. These are the ones here that I'd really want to focus on in my armies. C tier is fine, but I would heavily disincentivize people to to recruit these units, especially this one here. You're really going to run into problems, I think, if you recruit a lot of these. It's just very low value unit. But everything else is really good value. Anyway, that's the end of this video here. Let me know in the comments below what you think of this tier list, whether you agree or disagree. Appreciate you guys. Don't forget to subscribe and to follow me on Twitter. Appreciate you, and we'll see you next time, fuckers. Bye.